What I'm most happy about is that Brian Wilson dying in 2025 means that he died with a restored and well-deserved good reputation. The word in the media on Brian Wilson from journalists and from his peers, it's all good. And that wouldn't necessarily have been the case years ago. So we have the fans mostly to thank for that, for restoring his reputation that didn't always used to be so good. So I've been a Beach Boys fan since I was 5 years old. I've been a hardcore Brian Wilson fan since my early 20s, since the 90s. First time I saw him in concert was 2001. He was on a split bill with Paul Simon. Saw him at the XL Energy Center with my mom. I wanted to go the year before in 2000 when he was, when he had the Pet Sounds reenactment, or he got a band together and was going to play the entire Pet Sounds. I had no money. I was poor. I was in my early 20s. I never had any extra money in those days. And I tried to win tickets on Cool 108, but I needed to be caller 7. I was caller 6 or something like that, so I missed out. Anyway, the point is, back in my early 20s, in the late 90s, it was not cool to be a Beach Boys fan. Not at all. Being a Beach Boys fan back then was mostly us, the chosen few, the real fans, trying to convince other people, this is great, this guy is a genius, you got to listen to this stuff. And there's a reason why the name of Brian Wilson was maligned. Now, I don't think it was fair, but there's reasons why. So essentially, the Beach Boys came out in the early 60s. They were the biggest rock band in the United States till the Beatles showed up. Then all of a sudden, they were kind of overpowered by this, hot new band that was brilliant, no question about it. So they still did extremely well in spite of the British invasion and the competition of all these groups. They did extremely well. They made a ton of money. They sold millions of records. Extremely successful, no question about it. 1965, I might be off on my details a little bit here. Brian has a nervous breakdown. Can't tour anymore. So he decides he's going to stay in the studio and make the records. And the band was going to go out on their own. They got a replacement. They had Glenn Campbell. Then they got Bruce Johnston, who's actually still in the band that goes by the name of the Beach Boys to this day. And Bruce Johnston is a very talented person, by the way. So then it's like, okay, Brian's mentally ill, which was stigmatized back then. But he manages to make even more sophisticated, artful pop music that also sells well into 1966. They make their albums just keep getting more mature and better. They got All Summer Long. They got the Beach Boys Today. They got Summer Days and Summer Nights. Great records. Then Pet Sounds. Now Brian he's gonna make an artistic introspective, personal album, which was essentially a solo album. He made it while the guys were on tour. They came back, overdubbed their vocals. They had very little to do with it, really. Al Jardine suggested they do Sloop John B, and then that becomes the track right in the middle, and that's the only non-original. Doesn't do great, but it is a critical success. Still had singles. Wouldn't It Be Nice, God Only Knows, Sloop John B still sold. You know, those singles sold. Then he makes Good Vibrations, the greatest pop single in the history of music. The best. He takes months to make it. It's so expensive. He uses like 4 different studios, 3 or 4 different studios, because he's got it. Brian's ear is so high level that he has sounds that he likes in different studios. So Good Vibrations, million seller, biggest Beach Boys song ever in terms of sales. The Beach Boys are riding high. This is 1966. They were voted best vocal group by the, I think it was Melody Maker magazine in England, in London. So the kids in England said, we like the Beach Boys more than the Beatles in 1966. A lot of people don't know that. So then Brian decides to take it to an even higher level, starts working on Smile. Smile ends badly. Doesn't work out. He doesn't really finish it. Mike Love hates it. Mike Love hated Pet Sounds. Didn't want to do it. Hated Smile. Bullied Brian. That's why we hate Mike Love. It's the biggest reason why we hate Mike Love. He only cares about commercial success. If it sells, he's fine with it. He doesn't want any artsy fartsy shit. He said, Brian, don't fuck with the formula. We sing about cars, girls, sun, surfing. That's the formula. We're making money. Don't rock the boat here. He says that to the visionary, the songwriter behind this group, the cash cow. It's all Brian. Mike Love is a half-wit who was the luckiest human being in the world to be born the first cousin of Brian Wilson, and then gets to be the lead singer of the Beach Boys because his cousin is Bach of the 1940s. If Bach was born in 1942, that's Brian Wilson. So Smile is supposed to come out in early 1967. It does not. We could talk about this for days, but the album gets shelved. He just drops it, lets it go. What does come out in June of 1967 instead, in its place? Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. So the Beatles had a perfect career. Could not have been any better. The Beach Boys, not a perfect career. Some highs, a lot of success, but they kind of crashed and they stopped having hits in 1967. They kept going. They made a lot of albums. Some of them were very good, but it was never the same again after Good Vibrations. So Brian has a mental illness, schizoaffective disorder, which is like having schizophrenia and bipolar all at once. Nobody understands this back then. They didn't know what it was. Mental illness was stigmatized. So everyone just thinks he's crazy, he's eccentric, whatever. He retreats to his bedroom. He's just grows his beard out, stops cutting his hair. People don't really understand him. He smokes a bunch of cigarettes, ruins his voice, does a whole bunch of drugs, drinks a whole bunch of alcohol. Just his diet goes to shit. At one point, he was eating birthday cake and steak for breakfast. He just didn't give a fuck. He just completely kind of threw in the towel on life for a while there. So at some point, I would say about 1977, the Beach Boys are making some pretty bad records. They're cheesy. I haven't even listened to them all. They're so bad. That's my opinion, but they're not good. Brian, he's not the producer anymore. Carl, younger brother Carl, is the new Beach Boys producer. And he did a great job. He took over for his brother, and he, starting on, I think it was Wild Honey. I'm trying to remember. No, that's not right. It was 2020 was the album, 1969. That was the first album that Carl produced. Their first single under Carl was I Can Hear Music, a Ronettes song. Ironically, the Ronettes and Phil Spector. That's who they covered, which was Brian Wilson's hero, was Phil Spector. So Brian sort of becomes, I don't know, he's like he becomes the troubled genius. But as time passes, his reputation really takes a hit. And also another thing about that is that the Beach Boys never really got with the late 60s. They were sort of stuck and pigeonholed as this old-fashioned kind of the culture changed, and the Beach Boys did not change with it. So fun, and Surfin' USA and all these hits that they had early on were now kind of considered corny, old-fashioned. You know, the kids wanted to hear, Jumpin' Jack Flash was cool now, not Surfer Girl anymore. And so let's fast forward now to the 1980s. So now Brian is he's not even really interested. He comes along for the tour sometimes, and then Mike Love is in charge. Mike Love is a joke. This man he's a narcissist. He thinks he walks on water. He's in charge of the band now. So the image of the band is Mike Love, which is a joke, which is why the Beach Boys became a laughingstock. The Beach Boys were doing state fair shows. They were already a nostalgia act. They were a nostalgia act in 1969, I hate to say it. The song Do It Again. Listen to that song. It's a song about how let's go back and do the surf thing again. It was lame. It's actually a pretty good song, but for Brian Wilson standards, it's not. I don't know. Part of me hates it, part of me loves it. It's an okay song, but it's not as good as they could have been. Whereas the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were just kept getting better, if anything. They were so cool. They were so great. The Beatles were making, you know, Abbey Road, and the Rolling Stones were making Beggar's Banquet and Let It Bleed, and the 60s were so radical, and the Beach Boys never really got with the program on that, because Brian stopped functioning and the hits also stopped coming. Every time they bring him on TV, it's like, what's wrong with Brian? So his image is, this guy's on drugs, he's crazy, he's mentally ill, he's eccentric, he's weird. That's what people think of Brian Wilson back in those days, back in the 80s. Mike Love takes the Beach Boys, he befriends John Stamos, takes the Beach Boys on the sitcom Full House, which was a show that my generation watched. Like my generation, we watched Saved by the Bell on Saturdays, and we watched Full House on Friday on ABC. We all watched it. And then when I was probably about 15, the Beach Boys went on Full House, and it was so cringe. It was awkward. This is like when Nirvana is hitting. That's what's happening in the culture then. And they all have beards, and they just look like your 40-year-old uncle. They're square. The Beach Boys were never really cool. The music was good, but the image was not there. Their dad, Murray Wilson, Brian, Carl, and Dennis's father, Murray, managed the band, and he dressed them. And they looked like the Kingston Trio. They looked like a 50s folk group with their striped shirts. They looked so dumb. And they were just kids. They didn't know. They just listened to their dad, and he was so forceful. They just did what he said. They were still wearing those stupid striped shirts when they went over to London, when they were voted best vocal group in the world by the kids that read Melody Maker, I think is the name of the magazine. Dennis Wilson came off stage. Dennis was the drummer, handsome guy, the cool beach boy, the only guy that actually surfed. Dennis got off stage, was crying because they laughed at them. They got up there and they played the Pet Sounds songs and they played Good Vibrations, but they looked like squares. They looked like they voted Republican, which they probably did. Even though they smoked marijuana, you know. But so they never really were. The Beatles looked so great. The Rolling Stones, they looked so cool. The Kinks, I could go on and on. They look so great. Beach Boys, they kind of looked like they were from the 1950s, which did not do them any favors. So, yes, they go on Full House, which is, I argue, why my generation thinks the Beach Boys are a laughingstock, because that's our point of reference. They were this oldies group that came to the state fair every year and played at the grandstand, played songs from when our parents were children, and they went on Full House, which was the cheesiest TV show, even though we watched it, but I think we kind of made fun of it. And so, and yet still mental illness is stigmatized and not understood. So when you have a major mental illness, you're just considered crazy and there's no empathy. So now, cut to, oh, I completely glossed over the fact that Brian Wilson had a therapist who took over his affairs, took over legal guardianship, and Brian was a captive in this guy's home because he was a vulnerable adult. Eugene Landy. There's three main evil people in the Beach Boys story. Murray Wilson, Brian's father, abusive, beat those boys hard. Those boys got whipped and they had to be perfect. This is a old Swede who liked to beat up his kids. Mean old man. Kind of like Michael Jackson's father, Joe Jackson. Very similar kind of guy. Wanted those kids to be perfect, or somebody was going to get their ass beat. All right? You got Murray Wilson, you got Mike Love, and you got Eugene Landy. Those are your three evil people in the Brian Wilson Beach Boys story. But Eugene Landy, I mean, Brian was a captive in this guy's house. So Brian somehow gets away from this guy, meets this wonderful woman, Melinda. They get married in the 90s. And thank God for Melinda, Brian makes a solo record with Love and Mercy, the big song that everyone knows now. And then all of a sudden he's got a solo career again, and he makes a few more records. He gets together with this band, the Wondermints, who are just fantastic musicians and singers. And this is when they decide, let's rehearse Pet Sounds. Let's get out and now let's get out and play it. Brian has terrible stage fright, by the way. So all this getting Brian on stage again, this entire time of trying to get Brian on stage, Brian is not like getting on stage ever, really. But this band is supportive and kind of helps him get up there and perform these songs. And so they get up and they do Pet Sounds. Then the unthinkable happens. They start talking about Smile. Next thing you know, Brian is willing to revisit Smile. Smile was, to Brian Wilson, think of your most embarrassing, humiliating thing of your entire life. Did you ever start to try to do something? You had this grand vision and you failed. And you never want to talk about it or think about it again. But on a grand scale, where you're a recording artist that is world famous and you've sold millions of records. It'd be like if Paul McCartney had given up on Sgt. Pepper, which became, most people cite that as the top rock and roll record ever made. But things have changed a little bit there, because now people are talking about Pet Sounds as potentially the biggest record. Anyway, Brian gets up and decides, I'm gonna I'm going to re-record Smile as Brian Wilson presents Smile with his new band, not the Beach Boys. Then he tours it. And just getting up, the courage it took for him to do that. He doesn't even like getting on the airplane. He hears voices. And these voices are saying scary things to him, like, I'm gonna kill you. I remember him saying in his autobiography, someone said, what do you think when you get on the airplane? And he says, don't die, don't die, don't die, don't die. So he's scared to fly, he's scared to get on stage. Terrible stage fright. Meanwhile, late 90s, early 2000s, when I'm heavily absorbing this music and reading and learning anything I can about Brian Wilson, it was not cool to be a Beach Boys fan or even a Brian Wilson fan. And the point of all this is to say that sometimes you can change the narrative of something because most people just repeat what they're told. I just saw a video of James Hetfield of Metallica, because when Brian Wilson died on Wednesday, they asked everybody, what do you think of Brian Wilson? What did James Hetfield say? Just the boilerplate talking points. Oh, genius. Great songwriter. Pet Sounds. Wow. God only knows. What a song. He's a legend. His music's gonna live forever. I'm not saying James Hetfield hasn't ever listened to the Beach Boys, but I'm pretty sure he's not a fan. And they just asked him because he's famous and he also plays rock and roll. But if you had asked James Hetfield that same question 20 years ago, 30 years ago, he might have said, I don't even like the Beach Boys. Or he might have said something even worse. He might have said, oh, isn't that guy kind of cuckoo? Didn't he lay in bed for a few years and do a bunch of drugs? Isn't he kind of a weird guy? But no, the fans, and I credit us fans for doing this because I would like to take a small part of credit for that with many other people, because we have helped rebuild this reputation. And not just us, but other people that care about Brian deeply. Like the movie Love and Mercy. That was so great for people to see that because that gave people empathy. And I also think the culture has changed. Mental illness is more accepted now and understood. And people have empathy. They understand what it means to have a mental illness, and it's becoming more acceptable to talk about it. So we have been for years, for decades now, us fans, some of the authors that have written books. Dominic Prior, he wrote a book about Smile. There's been some very sympathetic authors who have helped change this narrative too. And I don't want it to be that Brian Wilson is a saint. He never did anything wrong in his life. Everything he did in his career was flawless. He's a genius. There's nothing, there's good and bad about all people, including Brian Wilson. But there is no denying that Brian Wilson is an extraordinary talent. And I would say, personally, he's my top of the 60s. He's the top songwriter. And I'm talking about Bob Dylan, Paul McCartney, John Lennon, Carole King, Stephen Stills. Just keep naming rock and roll people. Brian's the top of the heap. But I think that the fans of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, all these people, I think everyone can agree that Brian is right with the top. If you like Paul McCartney better, fine, but you're gonna agree that Brian is a peer. Paul McCartney himself we have to thank for telling the world, because Mr. Perfect, Paul McCartney, he's had some struggles. His mom died. Not trying to act like his life's been perfect, but his career has been perfect. He's the luckiest man to ever live in show business. Everyone loves Paul McCartney. Borderline worships Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney said, "God Only Knows is the greatest song I've ever heard." Oh, Paul McCartney loves God Only Knows. Now everybody starts listening to Pet Sounds, and then it comes out that, gee, Brian Wilson was in a creative competition with the Beatles that people don't even really realize. Probably at the time, and definitely up until recently, people didn't even know that. So we learned that Brian, well, they loved the Beach Boys, or they loved the Beatles. The Beach Boys loved the Beatles. They looked up to the Beatles. Everybody did. And we all know that the Beatles inspired everyone. But what we didn't know is that the Beatles were listening to everything Brian Wilson was doing. And at a certain point, well, the story goes, Brian heard Rubber Soul, which is kind of like the first rock and roll album to be considered a work of art. Rock and roll used to be about the single. You'd buy the 45 little record, and there'd be an A side and a B side. You'd buy there was always LPs. I mean, Elvis put out LPs, but it was generally, you had side one had a good song, side two had a good song, and then there was some filler. Rubber Soul was the first, top to bottom, every song's good, and there really isn't a single. Every song is good. You could drop the needle down on every song on Rubber Soul, and it could be a top 10 hit. Brian hears that and goes, oh, by the way, the Beatles are listening to Bob Dylan, which is, you can hear Bob Dylan in Norwegian Wood and some of these songs. Beatles don't just create something out of nothing. They're a product of what they've been listening to. But anyway, Brian hears Rubber Soul and says, this is amazing. The stuff they've been doing up till now is great. This is amazing. I'm gonna make something good. So what does Brian do? He makes Pet Sounds. The Beatles hear Pet Sounds, which didn't sell very well for a Beach Boys album. The Beatles hear this and they go, oh shit. We gotta up our game. So Rubber Soul influences Pet Sounds. Pet Sounds influences Sgt. Pepper. And unfortunately, the rivalry kind of ends at that point because, like I said, Smile gets abandoned and there's no more Paul McCartney, Brian Wilson, and John Lennon, sort of that relationship kind of ends, because the Beach Boys aren't making their top material anymore. They're not making the top shelf material anymore. So, but the fans, some of these authors, Paul McCartney, all these other either peers or people that came after him. Bruce Springsteen is a huge champion of Brian Wilson. Because the general public does not critically think. They don't really think for themselves. Most people just kind of buy whatever's popular, and they just kind of repeat whatever they're told. And had Brian Wilson died in any time in the 80s, and I mean any time in the 90s, I think this would have been a lot different of a narrative. I was seeing some headlines that said troubled genius, which is kind of a subtle way of saying brilliant but crazy, which I don't appreciate. Like I said, it doesn't have to be that Brian is perfect, Brian can do no wrong. We can't all be Paul McCartney, where no one has anything bad to say about him at all. Everything he touched turned to gold. Not every song Brian wrote was amazing, but he wrote many, many amazing songs. So I'm happy. Yeah, so the people, people just repeat whatever they're told. Like James Hetfield of Metallica. Genius, Pet Sounds, God Only Knows. Great songwriter. That's what everyone is saying now. Because we worked so hard to what's the word I'm trying to look for? We rehabilitated his image. The fans did that. We also have successfully demonized Mike Love, as though people couldn't figure that out for themselves. With his watch Mike Love's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction speech. This guy is the biggest goddamn joke. Mike Love sang on the early Beach Boys records. He fit the music. He fit the songs. It worked. The guy can sing. Of course he can sing. Brian would not have him in the band if he couldn't sing. But by Pet Sounds, he didn't fit anymore. He was not. His voice was not fitting with what Brian was doing anymore. So, where was I going with this? Mike Love is a fucking joke. And yes, I remember. And the fans we've elevated Brian to the reputation that he deserves, and we've exposed Mike Love for being a greedy, self-centered, egotistical, money-grubbing, talentless fuck. We didn't even talk about that Mike Love sued his own cousin. Mike put some words on some Beach Boys songs. There's no question about it. She's real fine, my 409. Yeah. That genius Mike Love came up with that line. You know what else he came up with? Good night, my baby. Sleep tight, my baby. That was his contribution that he sued Brian to get songwriting credit for. Good night, my baby. Sleep tight, my baby. That's what he did. That's like Picasso gets done with a painting and his I'm trying to think of a politically correct word. His moron of a first cousin walks up and does a little doop with the paintbrush and goes, all right, now it's perfect. And I want half the credit for writing this song too. Hate Mike Love. I couldn't help myself. Al Jardine on his Instagram, the day Brian died, he posted a really nice picture and he had some nice words. And I said, I love you all except for Mike. Even on the day Brian died, I still had no problem with trashing Mike. Because if it wasn't for Mike, we might have had Smile. And we'll never know because it didn't happen. The fans like me, our dream was that Smile had come out. It was supposed to come out no later than May of '67, and then they would have struck gold first. They would have had the avant-garde pop album, and it was like at the Monterey Pop Festival when Jimi Hendrix and The Who were fighting backstage of who got to go on first. We want to get out there and show that we are the innovators. We are the real unique ones. And they had a coin toss and Jimi Hendrix won, and he got out there and he fucking smashed his guitar and lit it on fire. And The Who was like, fuck, now we're gonna look like posers. He stole our act. But that was kind of the final act in the creative Cold War between John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and Brian Wilson. Was they got Sgt. Pepper into stores first, and Smile actually never even came out. They released Smiley Smile later, which was not even close. Not even close to what the real Smile would have been. Also, the real Smile did. First, Brian made Brian Wilson Presents Smile, which wasn't exactly the same as the real Smile, but it was close. And then in 2011, the real Smile, the tapes got released. And what's frustrating to me is it sounded like a finished product to me. They could have released it. Brian is such a perfectionist that he just kept wanting to change it and make it better and do it over, and this just went on so long, and everyone got so frustrated, and Brian was spiraling into mental illness, and it just got abandoned. So, but everyone got to go see Smile live, including me. In 2004, I saw him in Minneapolis at the Orpheum. It was the greatest concert I've ever seen in my life. At one point, because I hadn't heard, I wasn't one of these people that had like the Smile bootleg, and I had only heard Smiley Smile. And I think I I think Brian Wilson Presents Smile was already out on CD, and I must have, I don't know. I'm trying to remember. This is so long ago. This is over 20 years ago. But I remember just turning and looking at my mom and saying, can you believe that he came up with this? This is unbelievable. Blew my mind. And that's what really hurts, is Brian could have gotten another one over. He would have been 2 for 2. I've always said Brian should have called Pet Sounds. I have all kinds of names for it, but I live vicariously through Brian because I don't have his talent, but he's my guy. And all of us people without extraordinary musical talent, we kind of have our guys or our women that we sort of we fly their flag. And I think that Brian should have called Pet Sounds You Suck Beatles, or Are You Ready to Give Up Now? I don't know. I have all these trash talking names that he could have called the 2 albums. But anyway, he could have gone 2 for 2, because Smile is the greatest thing ever. Go listen to the Smile. You can hear it now. It's not on bootleg anymore. It's released. It's unbelievable. I was sitting at that concert, and one of the highlights for me that I remember is the during Good Vibrations, he had a Swedish, I think they were from Sweden, the strings, the cellos. Brian wanted cellos. The 16th notes, right? Is that a 16th note? But the cellists wearing the fire hats, because Brian was, I'll say it, Brian was a little out there, but he was fun, and he wanted people to have fun. He wanted people to really get into the moment, and he got fire hats for everybody in the studio. And back in 1966-67, and the Swedish cellists, maybe they were Norwegian, I can't remember, they had the fire hats, and they were doing the I'm picking up good vibrations. Oh, just one of the highlights of my whole life was seeing him do Smile in person, because all we had before that was Smiley Smile, which Carl Wilson called a bunt instead of a grand slam. I always like that description. And then there was the Smile tapes. You know, I remember Sean Lennon loves Brian Wilson. He's been a champion of Brian since I've been into Brian Wilson. We're the same age. I think Sean is born in 75. I'm 76. But that was amazing. And so we always kind of, I know I'm not alone. We wish that album had come out, because in an alternate version of history, we might be talking about Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys instead of the Beatles as being the greatest band. At least in terms of artistic achievement, because, and we think that would have also flipped the people, because, you know, the Beach Boys were still getting up with those striped shirts, and they were, you know, they were kind of considered square after a certain point, like I said. Also, we didn't even talk about the horrible career decisions that they've made. Did you know that the Beach Boys were supposed to headline the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967? And they turned it down. Imagine if the Beach Boys had gotten up and played Pet Sounds and Good Vibrations and Smile in front of that crowd of flower children. Summer of Love. No pun intended. Hate that fucker. That would have been another thing that would have changed the course of history. But none of that happened, and so that's the way it goes. One other thing I would like to say is that after their career went in the shitter in terms of commercial success, they made some good records. They made Wild Honey, Smiley Smile, actually Smiley Smile, then Wild Honey, Friends. I love Friends. You should listen to Friends. 68. Again, here's a oh man, what a great album. But the Beach Boys have lost the kids. They're on to the next thing. The Beach Boys are old news at that point. And it's like the reputation was damaged so much that they weren't going to win anybody back. The only album that they really they sold some copies and people respected them for a while was 1971's Surf's Up. They put that album out and people liked that one, and that sold some records. But Friends, then they had 2020. That's when Carl took over the production duties. Sunflower, 1970. Love Sunflower. Wow. People thought the Beach Boys' career was over after Pet Sounds. Nope. Listen to Sunflower. I love Sunflower. Then Surf's Up. Good album. And people took that one seriously. They sold some copies of that one. Because some of these Sunflower and Friends, oof, they were like 100 on the charts, and they didn't sell very many copies. It was really unfortunate. But then where do we go? Carl and the Passion's So Tough, 72. I don't love that one, but it's respectable. You know who likes that one? Elton John loves Carl and the Passions. It's one of his biggest inspirations. Then you got Holland. Good record. Really cool. Really interesting. There's some good songs on there. Also, the other guys are contributing. The other guys are writing songs, especially Dennis. Dennis had a solo career. Pacific Ocean Blue, Bamboo, and then Dennis drowned in 1983. He dove off his yacht or boat, whatever, in Marina del Rey, California. He dropped something at the bottom of the ocean and he went down to get it, and he never came back up. And Dennis was an alcoholic. Dennis died way before Brian, obviously, 1983. But so Holland, and then I'm trying to remember, where do we go after Holland? Like 15 big ones, which I don't like. The Beach Boys, Love You. I don't love it, but it's respectable. There's one song on there called The Night Was So Young that I love. It's one of the best Brian Wilson songs. But yeah, then, Brian was, the records after that, I haven't even listened to them all because they are bad, especially in the 80s. Oof. And then Kokomo. Final nail in the coffin. Fuck you, Mike Love. I hate that song. That is a terrible song. Brian had nothing to do with Kokomo, by the way. So again, my generation sees these old 40-year-old men with beards on fucking Full House singing Kokomo, and it was so stupid. They're better than that. And then there they are at the state fair, and some of us kids got, not me, but some of us kids got drug along to the state fair to see Mike Love's traveling circus of Beach Boys. Embarrassing. What else? Yeah, Brian was, and he got really fat, and he smoked he smoked so many cigarettes, and then he ruined his voice smoking so many cigarettes. Brian Wilson, I used to think Carl was the best singer in the Beach Boys, because you hear God Only Knows and you're like, whoa, this guy is an angel. Not true. Brian wrote the songs, produced them, recorded them, sang them, and he's the best singer in the band. He's everything. He's the best singer. So, so Brian, but he ruined his voice smoking cigarettes. And he ate whatever he wanted, and he got really fat, and which isn't a crime, but when you're in the public eye, I mean, he goes on these these TV shows, Letterman or whatever, and Merv Griffin or whatever, all these shows, maybe, what's his name? Oh shoot, I can't remember. They used to have a lot more talk shows back then, or late night shows. But he went, he'd go on there and he'd have his long hair and his beard, and he was fat, and he didn't look good, and, but things changed. He got out of the psycho's control and got remarried to Melinda, and I want to finish this up in under 1 hour, so it's going to be quick here. Really got his life back on track. None of this is his fault. His dad being abusive, his uncle being a dick, his cousin Mike being a dick, not his uncle. Being trapped by this manipulative psychopath, Eugene Landy, remember that name? I thought he put out a really good solo album in 1998, Imagination. I really like that one. There's a good live album called I Just Wasn't Made for These Times. Love that one. He kind of re-recorded some of his old songs. But in under 2 minutes here, I'm going to say that I went from trying to convince everyone, no, Brian Wilson is great. The Beach Boys are good. You're not getting it. And my friends and all my peers in Minneapolis, when I was kind of going out and seeing bands play, the record store owners, they knew what was up. The real music fans knew Brian was great, and they weren't going to be deterred by any of this Full House, Kokomo, Brian's on drugs, Brian's a crazy person. They weren't going to be deterred by any of that bullshit. But most people did not think well of Brian Wilson. And that has changed. And I'm so happy, because he deserves it. And I think I'll close on this. If you look at all of his peers, Bob Dylan loves Brian Wilson. That doesn't mean that just because Bob Dylan likes you doesn't mean that you're good. But not only do his peers have good things to say about him, they also seem to really like him as a person. And you can go all the way down the list. Mickey Dolenz, Paul McCartney, just John Fogerty, all his peers love Brian. And it's so heartwarming to see that, because he really was an exceptional talent, and he deserves the praise that he's getting and the restored reputation, because he deserves it. Love and mercy.